They whispered when a broken Navy SEAL returned to his grandfather's burned-down farm in Redwood Falls, Montana, until his loyal K-9, Ranger, dug something out of the storm cellar that exposed a lie buried for 25 years. After losing his place in the service, his family's honor, and the town's respect, Cole Whitaker had nothing left except an old iron key his grandfather once told him to protect, and the German shepherd who never left his side. When he finally opened the forgotten cellar beneath the ruined Whitaker land, Ranger began digging, and what they uncovered would not only clear his father's name, but force an entire town to face the truth it had refused to hear. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The morning over Redwood Falls, Montana, came in cold and colorless, with gray clouds pressing low against the jagged ridges, pine smoke drifting from old chimneys, and a thin mountain wind moving through the empty streets, as if the valley itself had grown tired of keeping secrets. The town was small enough for every truck to be recognized before it reached Main Street, small enough for people behind diner windows and hardware store counters to pause when a mud-streaked pickup rolled past the church, the feed mill, and the courthouse, carrying home a man many of them had not expected to see again. Behind the wheel sat Cole Whitaker, 42 years old, a Navy SEAL special operator with a square jaw, dark cropped hair, weathered skin, and sharp blue eyes that still searched rooftops, windows, and tree lines out of habit, his body dressed in full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3, long-sleeve blouse and matching trousers in green AOR 2 digital woodland, brown combat boots planted heavy beneath him, no helmet, and no vest, only the rigid control of a man trained for war and the quiet damage of a man who had brought some of that war home. In the passenger seat beside him sat Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd, K-9, with a thick black and tan coat, amber eyes, a small notch in one ear from an old deployment injury, and the kind of calm intelligence that made him seem less like a pet and more like a second soldier. Ranger had worked with Cole through desert heat, night raids, hidden explosives, and the long silence after missions where nobody said the names of the men who did not come back. And even now, with gray beginning to touch his muzzle, he watched the town through the windshield with steady alertness. Cole had been placed on temporary leave after his last mission overseas, not because he had failed in the field, but because the field had followed him into his sleep, into sudden noises, into the blank moments when his hands tightened around nothing, and Ranger was the only living thing that could bring him back without asking questions. Redwood Falls had never been gentle with the Whitaker name, and as Cole turned off Main Street toward the old farm road, he could feel the town looking at him before he saw a single face. 25 years earlier, his father, Thomas Whitaker, had been accused of stealing from the Veterans Relief Fund, and in a place where reputation mattered almost as much as land, that accusation had become a sentence without a courtroom. Thomas had been a broad-shouldered former Army medic with quiet brown eyes, rough hands, and a habit of fixing broken porch steps for widows who could not pay him. Yet after the scandal, every kind thing he had done was swallowed by one ugly story, and he died years later, with people still lowering their voices when his truck passed. Cole had been young then, old enough to understand shame but not old enough to fight it. And now, returning as a decorated SEAL, he discovered that medals did not clean a family name once a town decided it preferred the stain. The Whitaker farm waited beyond a line of leaning fence posts, where winter yellow grass bent under the wind and the barn sagged like an old animal, too tired to stand straight. Cole stopped the truck near the porch and stared at the red foreclosure notice nailed to the front door, its paper snapping softly against peeling white paint. This had been Henry Whitaker's last place, the farm Cole's grandfather had fought to keep after Thomas lost work, friends, and eventually the will to defend himself. Henry had been tall, narrow, silver-haired, and steady, with weather-cut cheeks and pale gray eyes that rarely showed fear. A man who spoke little but noticed everything, and when Cole was a boy, Henry had taught him how to mend fences, read storm clouds, and stand still when angry men wanted him to swing first. Seeing the bank notice on Henry's door felt less like losing land and more like watching the final witness to the family's truth being taken away. Cole stepped onto the porch with Ranger close behind, the boards creaking under his boots while the dog lowered his nose and tested the air. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of dust, cold wood, and old memories left too long in closed rooms, with sheets covering furniture, empty spaces on the walls where pictures had once hung, and cardboard boxes stacked near the hallway as if someone had started packing a life and then lost the strength to finish. Cole moved through the room slowly, touching nothing at first, until he found a photograph on the kitchen table showing Henry beside Thomas at a county fair, both men smiling under a summer sky. Thomas looked younger in that picture, strong and unguarded, and Henry stood beside him with one hand on his shoulder, as if already trying to hold the family together before the town pulled it apart. Cole set the photo down carefully, because even paper could feel heavy when it carried the faces of men who had died unheard. While Cole stood in the silence of the farm, Emily Carter sat in a cramped office above the Redwood Falls ledger, where rain-stained windows looked over Main Street, and a wall behind her desk was covered with maps, foreclosure notices, bank letters, and red string connecting names most people believed had nothing to do with one another. Emily was 31, tall and lean, with auburn hair usually tied back carelessly, green eyes that missed very little, and a controlled, polite voice that often made dishonest men underestimate how much anger she kept hidden beneath it. Her father had died waiting for veterans' benefits that never fully came, and that loss had made her gentle with broken families, but hard toward institutions that used paperwork like a weapon. For weeks, she had been investigating strange land losses among veterans' families, debts that appeared without clear origin, signatures that looked too similar, and foreclosure notices that moved faster than honest law should allow. On Emily's desk lay the newest notice, and the name at the top made the work personal in a way she had tried to avoid. Luke Carter, her younger brother, was 26, sandy-haired, broad-shouldered in the loose way of a mechanic who spent long days under engines, with grease always caught near his fingernails and humor always ready when fear came too close. Luke had inherited their father's small house near the rail spur, and although he was stubborn, generous, and careless with money only when someone else needed help, Emily knew he had never borrowed the amount the bank now claimed he owed. His house was one of several marked for seizure, and many of those properties had belonged to veterans or their families, which made Emily circle his name in black ink, then circle the others, her expression tightening as the pattern became too clear to dismiss. Back at the farm, Ranger led Cole down the hallway to Henry's bedroom, where a cedar footlocker sat at the foot of the bed beneath a folded quilt, its brass corners tarnished, and its lid marked with pale scratches from decades of use. Cole remembered that box from childhood, remembered being told never to open it, remembered Henry's quiet face whenever anyone asked what he kept inside. The latch was not locked now, only stiff with age, and when Cole lifted the lid, the smell of pipe, tobacco, wool, and old paper rose into the room. Inside were work gloves, a cracked pocket knife, a faded photograph of Cole as a boy sitting on the fence, and beneath those ordinary things, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, a narrow iron key, heavier than it looked. Ranger stepped forward at once, nose working fast, ears lifting, body suddenly still. Cole unfolded the oilcloth and found a note tucked beneath the key. The paper yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably Henry's, careful block letters pressed hard into the page, as if written by a man who wanted the words to survive longer than he did. If they take everything from you, go beneath the storm cellar. Cole read the sentence once, then again, while wind tapped against the bedroom window and the foreclosure notice snapped on the front door, somewhere behind him. Ranger sniffed the key, gave a low rumble, and turned toward the back fields where the older Whitaker ruins lay beyond the rise, half hidden by weeds and weather. Cole closed his hand around the iron key, and for the first time since driving into Redwood Falls, the lost look in his eyes changed into something steadier, because he did not yet know what Henry had left behind, but his K9 had found the first trail. Cole Whitaker stood for a long moment in Henry's silent bedroom with the iron key closed inside his fist, while Ranger remained near the hallway with his ears forward and his body angled toward the back fields. And outside the old farmhouse, the Montana wind moved through winter grass with a low, steady hiss that seemed to pull everything in one direction, away from the foreclosure notice on the front door and toward the darker rise of land behind the barn. Cole slipped Henry's note into the breast pocket of his full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 blouse. The green AOR2 digital woodland fabric faded slightly at the elbows from use, then adjusted the strap of the small field pack he had taken from the truck, not because he expected trouble, But because a seal learned early that trouble did not wait for permission, Ranger stepped off the porch first, his black and tan coat rippling under the gray light, his nose low, his pace controlled, and Cole followed him past the leaning fence, past a broken water trough filled with dead leaves, and into the old pasture where the Whitaker land stretched toward the ridge like a place the town had tried to forget. The burned farm sat beyond a shallow creek bed and a line of crooked cottonwoods, half hidden from the main house by a rise of earth and years of neglect. And when Cole reached it, he stopped with the same strange feeling he had known as a boy whenever Henry brought him there, and told him not to step too close to the blackened beams. The old house had burned long before Cole joined the Navy, long before Thomas Whitaker was dragged through the town's gossip, and now almost nothing remained except a stone foundation, waist-high weeds, patches of moss, and a few upright timbers charred so completely they looked like bones left standing after a firestorm. People in Redwood Falls had always called this ground worthless, saying the soil was too rocky, the access road too poor, the ruins too dangerous. But Henry had never said that. Henry had once stood near this same foundation with one hand on Cole's shoulder and told him in his gravel-thin voice that the most important things in life were rarely sitting where men could point at them, because anything valuable enough to protect usually had to be hidden deeper. Ranger circled the foundation slowly, moving with the deliberate patience of a trained K9 searching a hostile room, his paws pressing into wet grass, his muzzle brushing stone, ash, root, and frozen dirt, while Cole watched the dog work and felt old instincts waking beneath the exhaustion that had followed him home. The air smelled of pine sap, damp rock, and something older rising from the ground where snowmelt had soaked the earth. And every few seconds Ranger paused, tested the wind, then shifted direction, as if following a scent trail too faint for any human sense. Cole moved along the edge of the ruin, one gloved hand grazing the stone wall, and the place came back to him in broken images. Henry, carrying a lantern, Thomas repairing a fence in silence, himself as a child asking why no one rebuilt the house, and Henry answering only that some doors were meant to stay shut until the right day came. Across town, Emily Carter sat inside the county records office with a stack of copied land files spread across a long wooden table, her coat still damp from the morning mist, and her auburn hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck as she leaned over pages marked with loan numbers, survey lines, and foreclosure stamps that looked ordinary until they were placed side by side. The records clerk, Marlene Voss, watched from behind the counter with wary eyes and a pencil tucked into her gray bun. Marlene was a thin woman in her late 60s with narrow shoulders, wire-framed glasses, and the cautious politeness of someone who had spent 40 years handling other people's secrets without ever admitting which ones she remembered. She did not ask Emily why she needed so many copies, but she lingered nearby, and when Emily found Luke's file beside 3 other veterans' family properties, Marlene quietly said that old paperwork had a way of looking clean even when dirty hands had touched it. Emily looked up at that, but Marlene had already turned away, leaving the words hanging between the shelves like a warning. Emily returned to the files and began checking the witness lines, the notary seals, and the final approval stamps, and after several minutes, her pen stopped moving. On Luke Carter's foreclosure papers, on the old Whitaker farm transfer documents, and on 2 other properties seized from veterans' families, the same name appeared again and again as certifying authority: Sheriff Alan Pierce. Pierce was 58, broad through the chest, with silver hair combed neatly back, a square face that looked reassuring in campaign photographs, and a slow, fatherly way of speaking that had made the town trust him through floods, fires, funerals, and election years. People called him fair, steady, and old-fashioned, but Emily had learned that steady men could still cast long shadows, and the sight of his signature on unrelated files made the skin between her shoulders tighten. Back at the ruin, Ranger suddenly stopped near the far corner of the stone foundation, where vines and thick roots had grown over a flat shape in the ground. His body went still, his tail lowered, and a deep rumble rose from his chest, not loud enough to threaten, but clear enough to tell Cole that the search had ended. Cole stepped closer and pushed aside the grass with his boot, revealing the edge of a wooden door almost swallowed by the earth, its surface dark with age, its boards warped by rain and frost, its iron hinges rusted nearly black. For several seconds, Cole only stared, because he remembered this door from childhood, remembered Henry lowering a lantern toward it and saying the storm cellar was no place for a curious boy, remembered the smell of damp wood whenever storms rolled over the ridge, and the old man checked the latch as if the cellar held more than shelter. Cole knelt and cleared away the roots with his knife, cutting slowly, careful not to damage the rotted boards, while Ranger stood close enough that his shoulder brushed Cole's arm. The lock was old and nearly buried in rust, but when Cole slid Henry's iron key into it, the metal fit with a certainty that made his breath catch. He turned it once, hard, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the lock gave a dry internal snap, and the cellar door shifted beneath his hand, as if something below had exhaled after waiting years to be opened. Cole pulled, the hinges groaned, and cold air rose from the dark opening below, carrying the smell of packed dirt, stone, old water, and sealed time. Ranger leaned forward, sniffed into the darkness, and stiffened again. The wooden steps descended into a narrow chamber beneath the burned farm, and Cole took them slowly, one boot at a time, flashlight beam moving across stone walls and low support beams, while Ranger followed close behind, with the quiet precision of an animal trained not to panic in confined spaces. Halfway down, the smell of damp earth changed inside Cole's mind, twisting into dust and diesel smoke, and the groan of the wood beneath his boots became the deep metallic shudder of a damaged transport door somewhere overseas. The cellar disappeared for a heartbeat, replaced by a night raid gone wrong, muzzle flashes breaking across a mud wall, someone shouting his name through static, and the weight of a teammate's blood against his sleeve. Cole froze, his breathing turning shallow, his hand clenching around the flashlight as the past tried to drag him backward. Ranger moved instantly, pressing his head firmly into Cole's palm, then against his thigh, grounding him with steady warmth and familiar weight. And Cole forced his eyes onto the dog, onto the amber gaze, the black muzzle, the patient stillness that had pulled him out of darker places than this. He swallowed hard, breathed once, then again, and the cellar slowly returned around him. Stone, dirt, old wood, Montana cold, not war, not that night, not the men he could not save. Good boy, Cole murmured, his voice rough but controlled, and Ranger stayed close until the tremor in Cole's hand faded. Only then did they reach the floor, where the flashlight showed shelves collapsed along one wall, rusted tools near another, and a dirt corner packed darker than the rest. Ranger crossed the cellar with sudden purpose and stopped at that corner, nose pressed low, paws shifting quickly over the earth. Cole watched him scrape once, then twice, and when Ranger began digging harder, throwing loose dirt back in short, urgent strokes, Cole crouched beside him and cleared the area with his hands. "Easy," he said, though his own pulse had begun to rise. Ranger did not slow. His claws tore through the packed soil until a sharp metallic sound clicked beneath them, small but unmistakable in the cold chamber. Cole went still, one hand hovering over the dirt, while Ranger looked back at him with ears high and eyes bright, as if the trail Henry had hidden beneath the storm cellar had finally reached its first buried answer. Cole Whitaker kept one hand on Ranger's back, while the German shepherd stood over the disturbed patch of cellar floor, ears high, chest still, amber eyes locked on the place where his claws had struck metal, and for several seconds the only sound beneath the burned farm was the slow drip of water somewhere behind the stone wall, and Cole's own breathing as he stared at the dirt. He reached into his field pack, pulled out a folding and trenching tool, and began scraping carefully around the edge of whatever Ranger had uncovered, because the instinct to rush was there, strong and sharp, but training held him steady, the same discipline that had kept him alive in compounds, alleys, and desert rooms where one careless move could turn hidden truth into a final mistake. Loose soil came away in damp clumps, dark and cold against his gloves, and then the shape emerged, first as a corner, then a flat lid, then a rusted latch on an old military field box painted a faded moss green. Cole stopped digging when he saw the ghost of white stencil letters across the side, half rubbed away by time, and something tightened deep in his chest, because he had seen boxes like this in storage rooms, deployment staging areas, and the forgotten corners of military lives, but never buried beneath his grandfather's storm cellar. Ranger stepped back only when Cole gave a soft command, though the K9 stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed Cole's sleeve, watching every movement as Cole cleared the last soil from the box and worked his fingers under the metal handles. It came free with a wet pull, heavier than it looked, and when Cole dragged it onto the cellar floor, the sound scraped across the chamber like a coffin lid being moved after too many years. The latches were rusted, but not broken, and Cole forced them open one at a time until the lid gave a low groan. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and stacked with a care that was almost ceremonial, lay a collection of things the town had never known existed. An old Army medic badge that had belonged to Thomas Whitaker, several faded photographs of veterans gathered outside the Redwood Falls Community Hall, a bundle of letters tied with string, and yellowed bank documents folded beneath a flat packet marked Veterans Relief Fund. 1999. Cole touched the badge first, lifting it with a caution that felt close to grief, because Thomas had worn it when Cole was small, back when people still called him a good man without lowering their voices. The photographs came next, and in them Cole saw his father standing beside Henry, surrounded by men in worn jackets and work boots, older veterans with missing fingers, bad knees, tired eyes, and the quiet pride of people who had survived wars only to come home needing help with winter bills and medical fees. Thomas stood near a donation table, not smiling much, but looking steady, while beside him, Henry watched the crowd with that familiar guarded expression, as if he already understood that kindness could attract the wrong kind of attention. Cole unfolded the first bank record and felt his pulse slow into something colder than fear. The account numbers did not match the story Redwood Falls had repeated for 25 years. The missing money had not been withdrawn by Thomas Whitaker, not from the account named in the accusation, and not on the day the town claimed he had handled the funds. Instead, several transfers had been routed through temporary holding accounts, then moved toward land purchase deposits tied to families who later lost property under debt settlements. The paper did not explain everything, but it explained enough to break the first lock inside Cole's mind. Beneath the records lay a letter in Henry's handwriting, the words pressed into the page with the force of a man writing for someone who might not find it until everyone else was dead. Cole read it beneath the narrow beam of his flashlight while Ranger settled beside him like a silent guard. Henry wrote that Thomas had discovered something wrong in the relief fund shortly before the accusation. Not a simple mistake, not sloppy accounting, but a deliberate pattern in which money meant for struggling veterans was being redirected to pressure families into selling land cheap, land that was later transferred toward a timber development group operating behind shell buyers and friendly officials. Henry wrote that Thomas intended to expose it, and that within 2 weeks, the evidence turned against him so perfectly that even honest people believed the lie. He named no single villain at first, only a circle, a bank office that moved the money, a county desk that certified the papers, and the sheriff's authority that made frightened people stop asking questions. Cole read the final line twice. Your father was not careless, and he was not guilty. He saw the machine too early, and the machine chose him to crush. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and moved away from the box, nose low again, working along the back wall of the cellar where roots had pushed thin cracks through the stone. Cole almost called him back, but the dog's focus had changed, becoming sharp and certain, so he followed as Ranger pawed beneath a collapsed shelf and uncovered a smaller object wrapped in oilcloth, wedged behind a loose foundation stone. It was a narrow notebook, its leather cover stiff with age, and its pages protected by Henry's careful wrapping. Inside were dates, times, names, vehicle descriptions, and meeting locations written in Henry's block letters. Cole turned the pages slowly and found 3 names repeated across months of entries. Sheriff Allen Pierce, the respected lawman whose calm face had watched over Redwood Falls for decades. Martin Hale, the bank director, a neat, silver-templed man in his early 60s, known for polished shoes, soft hands, and a friendly smile that never reached his pale eyes. And Rebecca Sloan, a land broker in her 40s, with sleek blonde hair, expensive coats, and a reputation for speaking warmly while taking everything a desperate family had left to bargain with. Henry had written down meetings behind the bank, late visits to the records office, envelopes exchanged near the old rail depot, and one note that made Cole's jaw tighten. Pierce said Thomas will be blamed by Friday. While Cole sat beneath the burned farm reading the dead man's evidence, Emily Carter drove north of town along a road lined with frozen ditches and cedar posts, until she reached a small blue house at the edge of a hayfield, where Mrs. Abigail Brooks lived alone behind lace curtains and wind-bent lilacs. Abigail was 74, short and slightly stooped, with white hair pinned close to her head, careful hands, and soft gray eyes that carried the nervous habit of looking toward windows before answering difficult questions. She had once worked as a records assistant at Hale Community Bank, and for years people remembered her as polite, church-going, and almost invisible, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to funerals and never raised her voice in public. But when Emily showed her the copied foreclosure papers and the repeated signature of Sheriff Pierce, Abigail's face changed, not with surprise, but with the tired fear of someone who had spent half a lifetime hoping a buried thing would stay buried. At first, Abigail said she could not help, and her voice shook when she mentioned Martin Hale, because in 1999 Hale had been younger but already powerful, the kind of banker who knew which families were late on payments before they admitted it to themselves. Then Emily placed Luke Carter's notice on the kitchen table, and Abigail looked at the name for a long time before pulling a metal cookie tin from a pantry shelf. Inside were old photocopies, one unsigned memo, and a bank transfer slip she had hidden the year Thomas Whitaker was accused. She told Emily that she had seen false documents prepared after Thomas asked too many questions, that she had watched account pages replaced, signatures copied, and dates adjusted, and that she had remained silent because Sheriff Pierce visited her husband at work 2 days later and reminded him how easily a man could lose everything in a small town. Abigail's husband died years ago, still believing silence had protected them, but Abigail's hands trembled as she told Emily that silence had only protected the wrong people. By the time the light began to fade outside the storm cellar, Cole had arranged the contents of Henry's box across the dirt floor. Thomas's badge, the relief fund photographs, the bank records, Henry's letter, and the oilcloth notebook naming Pierce, Hale, and Sloan in a pattern too clear to dismiss as grief or coincidence. Ranger sat beside him, calm now, his tail resting against Cole's boot, as if the dog understood that the digging was done for the moment, and the harder work belonged to the man. Cole looked at the papers and saw more than his father's ruined name. He saw Luke Carter's house, the other veterans' families, the land that had vanished from people too tired or frightened to fight, and the town that had mistaken obedience for truth. If this evidence reached daylight, Thomas Whitaker might finally be remembered as the man he was, but more than that, Redwood Falls might have to face every home it had allowed to be taken under a lie. Cole closed the field box slowly, kept Henry's notebook in his hand, and looked down at Ranger. "This isn't just about Dad anymore," he said quietly, and in the cold beneath the burned farm, the first shape of justice began to form. Cole Whitaker carried the old field box into the Redwood Falls Sheriff's Office just after noon, with Ranger moving at his left side and the rain beginning to gather in dark sheets over the Montana hills. And the moment he stepped through the glass door, the room seemed to tighten around him. The office was warm, wood-paneled, and polished in the way small-town law offices often were, with framed commendations on the walls, a flag in the corner, and a front counter worn smooth by decades of complaints, permits, and quiet fear. Sheriff Alan Pierce looked up from behind his desk with the calm expression that had made people trust him for nearly 30 years. He was a broad-shouldered man of 58, silver-haired, clean-shaven, with pale blue eyes, and a slow, fatherly voice that could turn a threat into something that sounded like concern. Cole placed Henry's documents on the desk without raising his voice, and for one brief second, before Pierce's face settled back into practiced patience, the sheriff's eyes recognized the papers. Pierce leaned back, folded his hands over his belt, and listened, as Cole explained the hidden field box, the Veterans Relief Fund records, Henry's notes, and the names that appeared again and again in the notebook, but the sheriff did not look surprised enough, and that told Cole more than denial ever could. When Cole finished, Pierce sighed, like a man disappointed by bad news he had seen coming. He spoke gently, almost kindly, reminding Cole that war could bend memory, that trauma had a way of arranging shadows into enemies, and that everyone in town had heard about his temporary suspension after the last operation overseas. His words were careful, never directly cruel, but each one placed Cole's PTSD on the table beside the evidence, inviting anyone listening to choose which one felt easier to believe. A receptionist near the copier stopped moving. 2 deputies glanced toward the desk, and a farmer waiting by the door lowered his eyes, not because he had proof Cole was wrong, but because Redwood Falls had always found comfort in old stories. Emily Carter entered the sheriff's office during that silence, rein on the shoulders of her coat, and a leather folder pressed under one arm. And she immediately saw that Cole's documents matched the pattern she had been chasing through land files, copied deeds, and foreclosure notices. She did not interrupt at first. She watched Pierce speak with that same public kindness he used at funerals and town meetings, and she felt a chill move through her because she understood then how easily a respected man could make doubt sound reasonable. Emily was used to being dismissed, but she was not used to watching another person's pain turned into evidence against him. When Pierce suggested that Cole leave the papers for proper review, Emily stepped forward and said the ledger would like a copy of the complaint on record. Pierce's eyes shifted to her, still calm but no longer warm, and in that small change, she understood that she had just stepped from observer to target. By evening, the rain had hardened into a cold mountain downpour, washing Main Street into blurred reflections of neon, headlights, and courthouse lamps. Emily returned to the Redwood Falls ledger and found the office door hanging open, the lock splintered, drawers pulled out, file folders dumped across the floor, and her wall of maps torn down so violently that red string still clung to thumbtacks like broken veins. Whoever had entered had not taken the old printer, the petty cash, or the camera from her desk. They had gone straight for the land files, the copies from the county records office, and the notes connected to Luke's foreclosure. Emily stood in the doorway, breathing slowly, fear pressing against her ribs, but anger holding her upright. At almost the same time, Luke Carter called from outside his garage, his voice forced steady as he told her that two men in a dark pickup had blocked the service bay and warned him he had until the end of the week to leave his father's house. One of them, Luke said, was tall and heavyset, with a shaved head, a scar across his lower lip, and the flat confidence of someone used to frightening people who had no one to call. Cole arrived at the ledger with Ranger 10 minutes later, still in his full NWU Type 3 uniform, the rain darkening the green AOR2 pattern and running from his brown combat boots onto the floorboards. Ranger moved through the damaged office with his nose low, ignoring the scattered papers and overturned chair until he reached the doorframe, where he stopped and sniffed the splintered wood with sudden focus. Then, hours later, outside the sheriff's station, he reacted the same way beside an older patrol vehicle parked near the back alley, a white and brown county unit with mud on the tires, and a faint smell of machine oil hanging around the passenger door. Cole watched the dog's body language change, saw the same alert stillness, the same lift of the ears, and he crouched beside him, touching two fingers to the metal near the handle. The odor was sharp beneath the rain, industrial and familiar, the same kind of Axle oil or gun shop lubricant left on the ledger door. And for Cole, it was enough to turn suspicion into a direction. Emily wanted to call it in, but Cole only looked toward the sheriff's office windows and reminded her quietly that if Pierce controlled the room where complaints disappeared, then evidence had to be carried somewhere he could not edit it before morning. They followed the clue not through the main road but along the old rail spur beyond the grain silo, where Redwood Falls thinned into abandoned storage sheds, gravel lots, and the dark outline of the train depot that had once moved timber out of the valley. The depot stood under the rain like a forgotten witness, its roof bowed, its windows boarded, its platform slick with moss, and as Emily's flashlight swept over old shipping marks stamped into the beams, she realized the place matched a notation in Henry's notebook. Ranger led them inside through a side door hanging loose on one hinge, while Cole moved with controlled silence, one hand guiding Emily behind him, his eyes checking corners, gaps, reflections, and lines of movement the way his training demanded. Inside the depot office, beneath a layer of dust and collapsed ceiling plaster, they found a rolled land map sealed in a cracked mailing tube, and Emily spread it across an old desk while rain hammered the roof overhead. The map showed Redwood Falls and the surrounding veteran homesteads marked in pencil, not randomly, but along an old timber access corridor running toward the North Ridge, where logging roads could be reopened if the right parcels changed hands. Several names were circled: Whitaker, Carter, Brooks, Donnelly, Reeves, Alvarez. Emily's face tightened as she recognized families she had interviewed, people who thought their losses were private failures when in fact, their land had been part of a design. Ranger, still working the room, scratched at a loose floorboard near a rusted stove, and Cole pried it up to reveal a small steel safe tucked beneath the joists, no larger than a toolbox, its combination lock already broken, as if someone had opened and hidden it again in a hurry. Inside the safe was a thin ledger wrapped in plastic, and when Emily opened it, the pages showed 25 years of names, debt amounts, pressure notes, and projected acquisition dates, each line colder than the last, because it reduced people to obstacles on land that someone else wanted. Some names were crossed out. Some had the word resolved beside them. Others, including Luke Carter, were marked active. Cole read until his father's name appeared near the beginning, beside a note that said, "Scapegoat accepted, town convinced." And the words struck him so hard that for a moment the depot seemed to tilt around him. Ranger pressed against his leg at once, grounding him before the old darkness could rise. Emily carefully photographed every page, her hands trembling only once, and then headlights swept across the boarded windows. Sheriff Pierce's voice came from outside, smooth even through the rain, telling Cole there was no need to make things worse, while two shadowed figures moved near the platform, and another blocked the side exit with a flashlight beam. Cole closed the ledger, handed it to Emily, and gave Ranger a low command. The K-9 slipped into the darkness beside him, silent and ready. Cole did not fight like a man trying to prove strength. He moved like a SEAL, trained to survive, using rain, darkness, angle, and timing, guiding Emily through a gap behind the freight room, cutting across broken pallets, sending Ranger ahead to clear the path, and drawing Pierce's men toward the wrong side of the depot with a thrown piece of metal that clattered against the tracks. By the time Pierce pushed through the office door, Cole, Emily, and Ranger were already outside in the storm, moving low through the weeds beyond the rail line, carrying the map, the ledger, and the first real proof that Redwood Falls had not been losing homes by accident. Sunday morning came over Redwood Falls with a pale, washed-out sky after the night storm, and the whole town seemed to shine with the uneasy cleanliness that follows hard rain. The church windows bright, the gravel lot damp, the pine trees dripping water along the road, and families stepping from pickup trucks in pressed coats, as if nothing in their valley had shifted beneath them during the dark hours before dawn. Cole Whitaker stood at the edge of the churchyard with the old moss-green field box in both hands, his full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 still marked by rain and mud from the rail depot, the long-sleeve blouse and matching trousers in green AOR 2 digital woodland, brown combat boots planted firmly in the gravel, his face tired but controlled, his blue eyes no longer carrying only loss, but a hard, quiet purpose. Ranger stood beside him. The 7-year-old German Shepherd K-9 alert and steady despite the long night, his black and tan coat brushed by the wind, his amber eyes fixed on the church doors, while Emily Carter prepared her phone for a live stream and Luke Carter waited near the steps with a folder of copied land files held tight against his chest. Luke looked different in daylight than he had sounded over the phone the night before. Younger, more frightened, but unwilling to run, his sandy hair still damp from the rain, his mechanic's jacket zipped halfway over a clean shirt. Grease stains still visible along his knuckles because men like Luke did not stop being themselves just because the truth finally needed them. Emily had made 3 copies of everything they had taken from the depot: the land corridor map, the acquisition ledger, the photographs, and the pages tying Luke's house to the same scheme that had destroyed the Whitaker name, and she had given 1 packet to Luke before sunrise in case the originals vanished. Now she stood with her auburn hair pulled back, her green eyes sharp beneath exhaustion, and when the first viewers joined her live stream, she did not dramatize, did not accuse wildly, but simply said that Redwood Falls deserved to see documents hidden for 25 years. The crowd began to notice Cole before the church bell finished ringing, and whispers moved across the yard as people recognized the son of Thomas Whitaker, the SEAL on leave, the man Sheriff Pierce had already suggested, was unstable, and the dog who never left his side. Sheriff Alan Pierce appeared near the church entrance in a dark coat over his uniform, silver hair combed neatly back, broad shoulders squared, face calm in the way a man stays calm when he expects a crowd to follow his voice before their own eyes. He raised one hand and asked everyone to remain respectful, then turned toward Cole with public concern shaped into every line of his expression, saying that grief could make a man search for someone to blame, that military trauma could confuse old pain with present danger, and that Cole had clearly been through more than most people understood. The words moved through the churchyard smoothly, and for a moment some people looked uncertain, because Pierce had spent decades teaching them how to trust him. Cole did not answer the insult directly. He lowered the field box onto the wet gravel, opened the latches, and began placing Henry Whitaker's evidence where the people closest to him could see it. The letter naming the scheme, the bank records that showed the relief fund money had been routed away from Thomas, the photographs of the original Veterans Relief Committee, the notebook listing meetings between Pierce, Martin Hale, and Rebecca Sloan, and finally the depot ledger that marked families as targets instead of neighbors. Emily stood beside him and matched each piece with the records she had found, speaking clearly into the live stream as she showed Luke's foreclosure notice, the repeated certification stamps, and the old map that placed veteran homesteads along the hidden timber corridor. Her voice did not shake, and the steadiness of it began to do what anger could not, because one document might be dismissed, but a pattern laid out in sunlight had a way of making silence uncomfortable. Pierce tried to interrupt twice, first with patience, then with a sharper edge hidden beneath his polite tone, but the crowd had started leaning in, and the old habit of believing him was beginning to weaken. Then Mrs. Abigail Brooks stepped forward from beside the church steps, small and stooped in a navy wool coat, her white hair pinned carefully, her gray eyes wet but clear, and the sight of her drew a soft murmur, because everyone in Redwood Falls knew Abigail as a quiet, retired bank clerk who had never chased attention in her life. She looked first at Emily, then at Cole, and finally at the sheriff, and when she spoke, her voice was thin but carried farther than anyone expected. She said she had seen the false records prepared 25 years ago, that Thomas Whitaker had not stolen from the fund, that signatures had been copied, dates changed, and account pages replaced, and that Pierce had frightened her family into silence. The churchyard changed in that moment, not loudly, but deeply, as if the ground beneath an old story had finally cracked. Pierce's calm broke only slightly at first, a tightening around the mouth, a hard flash in the eyes. But when Abigail mentioned Martin Hale and the back office transfer slips, his hand moved toward the field box before he seemed to decide whether to reach for it. Cole saw the motion and shifted, but Pierce stepped faster than a man his age should have, grabbing for the documents, as if one violent second could undo 25 years. Ranger moved before Cole had to command him, launching between Pierce and the box with a low protective growl. His body angled to block the sheriff's hand, and the sudden movement forced Pierce backward against the church steps, where a broken pane of old safety glass, knocked loose from a storm-damaged side window, lay hidden near the stone edge. Ranger's front paw came down on the jagged glass as he turned, and a thin red line opened along his leg, bright against black fur and wet gravel. The crowd gasped as Ranger stumbled, then held himself upright, still trying to stay between Cole and the sheriff, and whatever suspicion remained in the churchyard seemed to fall away at the sight of the K9 bleeding for the man they had doubted. Cole dropped to one knee and caught Ranger gently by the shoulders, his controlled seal stillness breaking into something raw as he pressed a folded cloth against the wound and murmured for the dog to stay with him. Emily kept the live stream running with one hand while pulling out her phone with the other, and as Pierce tried to speak over the crowd, she played the recording she had captured outside the depot, his voice clear beneath the rain, admitting that the papers had to be buried again, that Hale had handled the accounts, that the Whitaker blame had worked once and could work again. The words poured into the churchyard like cold water over hot iron, and nobody could pretend not to hear them. Deputy Mason Reed stepped out from the side of the crowd then, a 34-year-old officer with a lean build, close-cropped brown hair, tired eyes, and the uncomfortable honesty of a man who had served under Pierce for years without wanting to believe what he now had to accept. Mason had grown up in Redwood Falls, had once looked at Pierce like a mentor, and perhaps that was why his hands trembled when he removed the sheriff's own cuffs from his belt. Pierce looked at him as if betrayal had arrived from the wrong direction, but Mason only told him to turn around, his voice low and strained, while people watched in stunned silence. When the cuffs closed around Pierce's wrists, no one cheered. They simply stood there, ashamed, seeing Thomas Whitaker's ruined name, Cole's wounded dog, Luke's threatened home, Abigail's lost courage, and their own 25 years of silence reflected back at them in the wet churchyard. Pierce was led toward the patrol car with his head lowered, his authority stripped away, not by force but by evidence, by one old woman's truth, by a reporter's refusal to stop digging, by a brother carrying copied papers, by a son who came home in uniform when everyone expected him to disappear, and by a K9 who had bled before the town finally understood loyalty. Cole stayed on the gravel with Ranger's head against his chest, feeling the dog's breathing steady beneath his hands, while Emily ended the live stream and Luke stood nearby with tears he tried to hide. Around them, the people of Redwood Falls did not rush forward with easy apologies, because shame had made them slow, but their faces had changed. For 25 years they had believed a lie because it was easier than questioning the men who told it. And now, beneath the brightening Sunday sky, they could no longer say the truth had been hidden from them. 1 year later, Redwood Falls looked almost unchanged from a distance, with the same pine-covered ridges rising behind the town, the same church steeple standing white against the Montana sky, the same gravel roads bending between ranch fences and weathered barns. Yet something deeper had shifted beneath the surface, the way ground shifts after a long winter thaw, and reveals what had been frozen for too many seasons. The story that began beneath Henry Whitaker's storm cellar had traveled farther than anyone expected, through courtrooms, newspapers, state investigators, and the quiet kitchens of veterans' families who had once believed they were alone in losing everything. Sheriff Alan Pierce no longer walked Main Street with his polished badge and fatherly smile, because a jury had found him guilty of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and intimidation. And Martin Hale, the smooth-handed bank director whose clean suits had hidden years of dirty transfers, had been convicted beside him after investigators followed the money through accounts, land deals, and timber contracts that all led back to the same old machine. The legal process had been slow, heavy, and painful, because truth did not repair a town as quickly as it exposed one. But little by little, the false land records were overturned, the forged debt claims were canceled, and families who had spent years believing they had failed were told that the failure had never been theirs. Some homes were returned outright, some families received settlements, and others came back only to stand in front of places they had lost and weep because even justice could not give back every year stolen from them. Luke Carter kept his father's house near the rail spur, and the morning the court order arrived, he stood in the doorway with the paper in his hand, sandy hair falling over tired eyes, grease still on his knuckles from a truck he had been fixing. And for once he had no joke ready. Emily Carter stood beside him, tall and lean in her dark reporter's coat, her auburn hair pinned back against the wind. And she placed one hand on her brother's shoulder without speaking, because some victories were too full of grief to celebrate loudly. On a clear autumn afternoon, the town gathered in the square for the memorial that Redwood Falls should have held 25 years earlier. A new bronze plaque stood near the flagpole, engraved with the name Thomas Whitaker, former Army medic, veterans advocate, falsely accused, finally cleared, and Cole Whitaker stood before it in full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3, long-sleeve blouse, and matching trousers in green AOR, 2 digital woodland, brown combat boots clean but worn, no helmet, no vest, his posture straight, but his face softer than it had been on the morning. He returned home, with nothing but Ranger, and a key. Ranger sat at his left side, the 7-year-old German Shepherd K9 now fully healed, his black and tan coat shining in the afternoon light, the faint scar on his front leg hidden beneath fur, unless someone knew where to look, his amber eyes steady on the crowd that had once doubted the man he protected. Emily received a regional journalism award for the investigation, though she accepted it in the same controlled voice she used when reading facts into a camera, because she never wanted the story to become about her instead of the families who had paid for the silence of powerful men. Mrs. Abigail Brooks sat in the front row of the ceremony, small and stooped in a pale blue coat, her white hair pinned neatly, her hands folded around a tissue, and when Cole thanked her for finally stepping forward, she lowered her head as if both relieved and ashamed. Deputy Mason Reed, now serving as acting sheriff while the county rebuilt the department, stood near the edge of the square, with his hat in his hands. A lean, quiet man still learning how to carry authority without copying the man who had misused it before him. No one in town pretended that one ceremony could erase 25 years, but for the first time, they had stopped pretending the lie had been harmless. Cole had been officially cleared by the Navy Review Board months earlier, his service record restored, the cloud around his suspension lifted after medical evaluators, and commanding officers recognized that he had not been broken by weakness, but carrying wounds that needed care instead of judgment. He could have returned to active operations, and part of him had considered it during sleepless nights when silence felt too wide. But the longer he stayed on Whitaker land, the more he understood that his next battlefield was not overseas. He had spent his life entering dangerous places to rescue strangers, and now, the dangerous place was a town learning how to tell the truth about itself. So he chose to stay, not as a man defeated by war, but as one who had finally found a mission that did not require leaving home. The old Whitaker property became Henry House, a veterans support and therapy dog training center built around the restored farmhouse, the repaired barn, and the preserved storm cellar where the first evidence had been found. Luke helped rebuild the porch, replace beams, and convert the barn into kennels and training space, working with the same stubborn generosity that had once made him fix engines for neighbors who could not pay. Emily helped create the public archive room, where copies of Henry's notebook, the court findings, and Thomas Whitaker's cleared record were displayed behind glass, not as decoration, but as a warning that paperwork could become a weapon when good people stopped checking whose hands held the pen. Ranger became the heart of the place, not because he performed tricks for visitors, but because veterans who arrived, guarded and silent, often relaxed when the old K9 settled beside them without asking anything, offering the same steady presence that had pulled Cole out of darkness more times than anyone knew. By the first anniversary of Pierce's arrest, the storm cellar no longer looked like a forgotten wound in the ground. Cole had reinforced the steps, cleaned the stone walls, and placed a simple wooden sign above the entrance that read, "The truth was found here." He stood there at sunset with Ranger beside him while the Montana sky turned gold behind the ridges, and the wind moved through the grass over the old burned foundation, where Henry had hidden proof for a day he might never live to see. Cole rested his hand on Ranger's head, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his palm, and thought of Henry's patience, Thomas's ruined name restored, Emily's courage, Luke's saved home, Abigail's confession, and a town that had finally been forced to look at itself. "Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear," Cole said quietly, his voice low enough that only Ranger could hear. "Sometimes it just waits for someone brave enough to come back and find it." Ranger leaned against his leg, tail moving once against the grass, and Cole smiled in a way that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. He was no longer the man who had driven into Redwood Falls with the weight of a family lie on his shoulders and a foreclosure notice waiting on the door. He had his father's name returned to the light, his grandfather's wisdom preserved in every board of Henry House, a community trying to repair what it had allowed to be broken, and a loyal K9 who had changed the fate of an entire valley by refusing to ignore what was buried beneath the ground. As the sun dropped behind the Montana mountains, the windows of Henry House glowed warm across the hillside, and Cole Whitaker stood with Ranger at his side, peaceful, free, and no longer alone. If this story teaches us anything, it is that truth may be buried for years, but God never forgets where it is hidden. Cole thought he had lost his home, his family name, and his purpose. Yet the Lord used a loyal K9 named Ranger, an old key, and one forgotten storm cellar to bring justice back into the light. Sometimes in our daily lives, we face lies, betrayal, silence, or pain that no one else can see, and we may feel like nobody understands what we have carried. But God sees every tear, every unfair moment, and every quiet prayer. He can turn a broken road into a miracle, a loyal companion into a messenger of hope, and a painful past into a new beginning. So never stop believing that what is right will one day rise, even if it takes time. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and the quiet miracles God places in our lives. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and give strength to every heart still waiting for the truth to come into the light. If you believe God can bring justice, healing, and miracles even after years of pain, comment Amen.